You are tuned into 93.6 FM and very excited today. We've got a new program, Beth on whiskey here on 93.6 FM. And immediately let me introduce the owner, Hector Macbeth, here in the studio. I welcome you, Hector. Great to have you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be out here, close to the sea. I can almost smell it and wave it.
It is quite wonderful. Hector, a little bit of, when it comes to a background with a surname like Macbeth, but you're South African.
Well, yes, I was born in Scotland, but we came over here at a very, very young age, and so grew up culturally as a South African with strong roots to my heritage. I mean, with a name like Macbeth, it was inevitable I would eventually be in whiskey or something Scottish, and I couldn't play the bagpipes and didn't like tartan that much either, so I suppose whiskey was the better option for me.
Right, and then after school you decided that that's going to become your career, that's what you educated yourself?
No, I realized that it might be a stretch too far. So I studied engineering and qualified as electronic engineer. I worked for Anglo America. I grew up in Welkom, so we had no choice really to go into the mines. But after that, moved down to Cape Town, got into hospitality, worked with a lot of different brands, and eventually sort of in 2002, I said, like, what really do I enjoy doing the most? And whiskey it was. And so that's been the journey since. I've been doing whiskey since 2000, basically, full time, yeah.
The route when it comes to whiskey in South Africa also very interesting because it was a kind of like very exclusive in the 60s and 70s, even maybe the 80s for us as South Africans. And now the explosion. What do you think happened, or what was the reason for that?
Well, I think it was a global phenomenon. That cognac and whiskey, these are really aspirational brands, especially with the sort of black diamonds coming up. They're looking for aspirational brands. And obviously whiskey had been doing it for 400 years, so it ticks those boxes. So was cognac and so on. But I just think whiskey just has that history and that passion behind it, and they're quite true to themselves. And I think South Africans can resonate with that, and that's why it really like I say, was a global explosion. And South Africa's twigged onto that, and they're so brand loyal. That's why it's really stuck, because you know you're looking at those big brands out there, the guys will drink them forever and a day, and that's the interesting thing about us, because we focus about all those sideline brands and the off the beaten track brands. Really, that's where we saw the real niche for our business, and so we thought, look, obviously we've got to educate people because we don't have big money budgets to spend. So we started looking at smaller distilleries and so on. And that's really what we focused on. And we're quite fortunate that, because we've been doing it for such a long time, that we're now sort of seen as sort of the experts in the field, so it's been a great journey. And I think, we're very fortunate that the big players have got massive budgets, so they get everybody interested. And then we just sort of pilfer off the sides and sort of take you in a direction that you maybe didn't think you were going to go to, but it's always been fun, yeah.
Let's just have a look at whiskey traditionally. It was something that was enjoyed maybe, after a meal or whatever the case may be, or when you go into a bar and you would order a whiskey, but it was never something that you would say was commercial. But it did become a little bit later on. But let's just go back to the 60s and 70s. Whiskey was very much for a specific person then.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it did get kind of typecast a little bit like that. And in fact, it was a global phenomenon. That in the 80s, we didn't even see whiskey booming at all. I mean, they had a whiskey lake and no consumers at all. But if you really go and study the last 400 years of whiskey, it is cyclical, Suddenly it's right on top there, and then it's down at the bottom again, and it's back up top there. But the 80s, we actually saw distilleries closing left, right, and center. So that's obviously where the marketing guys get involved, and they see an opportunity, okay, and we've got this lake of whiskey we've got to get rid of. How do we get rid of it? So then we say, well, you better try that Lagavulin that's been closed, or that one's been closed, and so that drives people back to it again. So in 15, 20 years later, we see this boom. But because the 80s, everyone was working 2-3 days a week instead of full-time, productions are much lower, so there's much less accessibility. And of course, as you know, if you can't get it, you want it even more. So that's really what propelled, especially single malt whiskey. And also back 60s, 70s in South Africa, sort of quite a closed market, not really international. People sanctioning cautioning us as well. So that's why you didn't get exposure to all the whiskey brands that were out there. So it was a couple of few commercial guys. And then, the focus was really, South Africa was a brandy drinking nation at that stage, predominantly. But that's sort of changed in the last 3 years. I think whiskey's outsold brandy for the first time. But having said that, though, brandy in South Africa, it was one of the last countries in the world where it was still the number one seller. And look, it's not far behind whiskey, so it's still very competitive. And in fact, last year there was a bit of a resurgence again in that field. So it's alcohol's always been a cyclical thing. Create a demand, take the brand away, then then fill it up again. So it'll continue to be like that.
And obviously whiskey, Scots, that's where it all started off.
Well, the word whiskey, and it's quite interesting why I really got into whiskey, but the word is ushkeba, is the Gaelic word. It means the water of life. So if you go back to that sort of history where it really came out.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, and Macbeth is actually son of life. So that's where my sort of link comes into it. So ushkeba is the water of life, and Macbeth is son of life. So you put those two together and it sort of works, doesn't it?
There's some magic there. Hector Macbeth with me here on 93.6 FM. Hector, we're going to play some music and then we're going to continue because I also want to know from you the right way to drink whiskey. But we'll talk about that later. This is all for you here on 93.6 FM.